afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual Cafecito lecture. My name is Natalie de la Torre Salas, and I am the public archaeologist for the Florida Public Archaeology Network's Southwest region. I hope everyone is having a great week and you have your cup of coffee or tea ready. Happy spooky season. We are thrilled to continue our Honrando Nuestra Historia series in celebration of Latinx Heritage Month with this special lecture presentation by Sarah McNamara titled Florida History is Latinx History, Researching, Finding, and Remembering Ybor City. So I'm gonna read the description of this presentation. So when we think about Latinx Florida, we often imagine Cuban immigrants who fled the regime of Fidel Castro in the 1950s and 1960s. But decades before Miami became Havana USA, a wave of leftist, radical, working class women and men from pre-revolutionary Cuba crossed the Florida Straits, made Ybor City the global capital of the Cuban cigar industry, and established the foundation of Latinidad in the Sunshine State. In this talk, Sarah McNamara, who is a historian and author of the book Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South, right here, amazing, I highly recommend everybody read it. She examines the history of immigrant and US-born Latinx who fought for survival across 3 generations and against the backdrop of a reconstructed Southern order. From Latinas who organized strikes, marched against fascism, and criticized US foreign policy, this history highlights the underexplored role of women's leadership within movements for social and economic justice, as it illustrates how people, places, and politics become who and what they are. And let me tell you a bit more about our wonderful guest. Sarah McNamara is an associate professor of history and core faculty in the Latina, Latino, and Latinx and Mexican American Studies program at Texas A&M University. But she is a Tampa native and her family is from Ybor City. So we're excited to have Sarah with us today, and we hope you enjoy this fascinating talk about Latinx history in Florida. So everybody, after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session where you'll be able to unmute and ask Sarah any questions you may have, or you can type them in the chat and we'll make sure to read them out loud, okay? But please stay muted during the presentation to avoid any disruptions. Now, without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Sarah. Thank you so much for being here.
No problem. Thank you for having me and inviting me. It is an honor to be here and talk to you all about my book, Ybor City, today. Ybor City and studying this place, it's something that was inherently a part of me, but it took a long time for me to understand Ybor City as a place that had historical value. Because like many people who examine Latinidad and come from Latino communities and Latinx communities, we oftentimes look at what history means in terms of what, especially when we're children, in terms of what other people tell us is important. And we forget that we ourselves have a history that is unbelievably important and foundational to not only what the United States is, but thinking globally and in terms of colonialism, anti-colonialism, as well as self-determination. So my inspiration for this book, it emerged from asking questions about myself and about my family and about my community, but its sources and its motivations, while myself is mixed within it, it came from the process of learning historical research and historical methodology and learning how to question. I would have never thought that Ybor City was a place that I would study or examine until professors who I met at the University of Florida asked me questions that led me to think about what history meant and that this place had a history too, and one that could center Latinas and Latinidad in a way that illustrated what it means to be Latina or Latino in the US. So Ybor City, my book, right, what we're here to talk about today, if I can figure out how to move the PowerPoint. I know you all would think that I don't do this every single day. So Ybor City, my book, it is the history of this place and this community. And for this talk, I'm going to bring you into this story through a narrative, and a narrative that is inherently a part of how I came to think about this place. And with that, I'll begin with a young woman named Amelia Alvarez. Amelia Alvarez, she was born in Cuba when the island was a Spanish colony. Yet by Amelia's 9th birthday, her home as she knew it no longer existed. The Cuban War for Independence, which U.S. imperial ambitions turned into the Cuban, Spanish, Puerto Rican, Filipino, American War, brought an end to Cuba's colonial status, as well as Cubans' hopes for a truly independent island. When Amelia turned 16, U.S. troops occupied Cuba for the second time in her life. That year, 1906, she boarded the steamship Olivet and sailed 110 miles from the port of Havana to Key West. Soft winds from the Florida Straits wrapped around Amelia as she passed through immigration and rested for a night. The next morning, she climbed aboard the same boat and journeyed another 250 miles northward through the warm waves of the Gulf of Mexico. Once the ship docked, Amelia descended the gangway and walked into Tampa, Florida. On the screen right now, you're looking at the manifest that includes Amelia's name, as well as the Olivet. At the turn of the 20th century, Tampa brimmed with chaotic possibility. Sounds of Spanish and English hovered in the heavy, humid air as Amelia navigated the throngs of people who crowded the port. More than 100 passengers charged forward with their luggage in hand, while stevedores unloaded bales of Cuban tobacco leaves from the ship's hold. 30 years earlier, this swampy town featured little more than an obscure military outpost in a settlement of sweaty Confederates. But by the time of Amelia's arrival, the Cuban cigar industry had changed nearly everything. Black and white immigrants, primarily from Cuba, along with others from Spain, Italy, and Puerto Rico, collided in Tampa as they searched for work in the city's new cigar factories. Once hired cigar workers stripped, sorted, and bunched tobacco leaves, then rolled, banded, and boxed cigars. The labor of these women and men transformed Tampa into the leading industrial center of the state, while their bodies, their cultures, and their politics created an international borderland in Jim Crow, Florida. On the dock that day, Amelia stayed near her family, for she had not come alone. Her sister and brother-in-law, their 2 children, and 3 aunts arrived together with $56 between them. As the family of 8 emerged from the bustling masses, they likely boarded a streetcar to carry them 6 miles down the road to their new home in a neighborhood called Ybor City. To Amelia, Ybor must have felt familiar and foreign at the same time. Red brick buildings with Moorish arches lined the streets, while ornate wrought iron twisted across glass windows and framed outdoor patios. Architectural remnants of colonial Spain seemed to echo through the streets, but it was the politics of Cuban independence that lived in people's homes. Some of Amelia's neighbors told tales of when José Martí, the famed Cuban poet and revolutionary, organized and collaborated with cigar workers to bring an end to Spanish rule in Cuba. Although this fight ended in 1898 when Amelia was 9 years old, the community she joined in Ybor remained unapologetically anti-colonial, pro-labor, and radically leftist in their self-proclaimed exile. From the perspective of Amelia's neighbors, Ybor City served as their sanctuary from the restrictive imperialist agendas and the oppressive anti-labor, anti-democratic conservative forces that lingered in their homeland even after the Spanish relinquished claim over the island. The 2-story Centro Obrero, the labor temple, labeled here, stood at the helm of this neighborhood and operated as the space where women and men organized unions, planned strike actions, and created a culture of labor on their own terms. Cigar factories defined the city landscape and separated Ybor's immigrants from Tampa's Anglo residents. This was a racialized border that likely seemed to Amelia uniquely American. As a Cuban woman with light skin, however, being the subject of segregation would have been a new experience that made Amelia acutely aware of her place within the South's racial hierarchy. Inside Ybor City, Amelia found acceptance. The things that Anglos believed made her seem different. Her appearance, her labor, her politics, her traditions, and her language were foundational elements that bonded this immigrant community. Despite living in a new country, Amelia never had a problem with communication because nearly everyone in Ybor spoke Spanish, and those who did not learned upon arrival. Sicilian grocers transformed their markets into hybrid bodegas as they sold Spanish chorizo alongside Italian pickled vegetables and elevated what is now known as the Cuban sandwich. The local version of this delicacy, stacked with layers of mojo marinated roasted pork, boiled ham, and hard salami on slices of Cuban bread, dressed with a swipe of yellow mustard, a piece of Swiss cheese, and a sliver of crisp dill pickle. According to community lore, the last three ingredients reflected the food traditions of Jewish merchants who came to Tampa in search of refuge from the escalation of anti-Semitism in Romania and Germany. Many of these families sold fabrics, clothing, shoes, and auto parts in dry goods stores, while others used their profits to purchase cigar factories of their own. Spanish newspapers thrived in Ybor and reported daily news from Havana, Madrid, Key West, and Tampa. This vibrant print culture not only kept Amelia and her neighbors informed of global affairs and local events, but made Ybor City an integral hub within a cross-national network of leftist activism and intellectualism that reached from the Caribbean to the Americas and across the Atlantic Ocean. As Amelia walked across the streets of Ybor City, she may have brushed shoulders with women such as Luisa Capetillo and Luisa Moreno, both Latina feminist labor organizers and leftist thinkers. Here they are. As well as people such as Eugene V. Debs and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, leaders of the socialist and communist movements, all of whom visited, organized, or sought refuge from political persecution in Ybor City. Each Saturday, the Afro-Cuban rhythms of rumba and the melodies of danzón, once outlawed in Spanish-controlled Cuba, spilled out from the ballrooms of the centros, also known as mutual aid societies, locally, and filled the streets of Ybor City. Yet as Amelia twirled across the dance floor of the Círculo Cubano, the Cuban club, she would have noticed that the Black Cuban women and men who worked beside her in the cigar factory were absent from this space. According to her neighbors, when the city of Tampa annexed Ybor City and made it part of Hillsborough County in 1887, Anglo political power holders mandated that the centros segregate their membership and create a separate club for Afro-Cubans. La Sociedad de la Unión Martí Maceo, in the lower quadrant here on the screen. The mutual aid society built by and for Black Cubans emerged as a result of this moment. The Ybor City of Amelia's youth was a place where multiracial, multi-ethnic, Latina and Latino self-determination endured, yet under the watchful eye of a reconstructed Southern order. After nearly 2 years of living and working in Ybor, and shortly after celebrating her 17th birthday, Amelia met and married a Spanish immigrant named Pedro Blanco. The young couple moved down the street and rented a house near their families. When Amelia looked out her front door, she would have seen rows of identical whitewashed shotgun houses that sat on narrow lots and flanked Ybor City's wide dirt roads. In many ways, Amelia's neighborhood was the turn-of-the-century version of a cheap housing development, a company town built for profit, but not for comfort. In wintertime, families pasted old newspapers to the walls in hope of stopping cold air from seeping into the house. And during the summertime, the wooden planks expanded and softened from the inescapable humidity that penetrated the wood. Although the casitas were imperfect, people made do. These homes, flaws and all, were better than the lodgings most cigar workers could access in Cuba or in smaller cigar working towns such as Key West. Amelia spent her days in the cigar factory and her nights gossiping on the front porch or gambling with other women in secret. Each night after dinner, her husband joined the men of Ybor at one of the local cantinas where the sounds of clinking dominoes cut through the smoke-filled room and the scent of whiskey clashed with the smell of sweet tobacco and the bellows of masculine laughter. I imagine that in the absence of men, Amelia and her friends talked about everything, from politics to children to money and memories of Cuba, Spain, and perhaps even Italy. Amelia created a life in Ybor City, but she never truly let go of the island. She and Pedro had 4 children, Delia, Pedro, Margot, and Dalia. Yet only the last 3 survived infancy. Her sister, Concepcion Camero, rented the house next door until she and her 3 sons moved to Puerto Rico, where they stayed. Amelia visited her parents and siblings in Cuba roughly once a decade and always in July. At first, she traveled by water, retracing her original path to Tampa. By the 1940s, however, the steamship stopped sailing and Amelia flew Pan American Airways. Every time Amelia left Florida, she used her Cuban passport because she never applied for U.S. citizenship. Perhaps U.S. citizenship seemed unnecessary, perhaps it seemed impossible to obtain, or perhaps Cuban citizenship was a part of herself she never wished to surrender. In 1952, at the age of 63, Amelia passed away and was buried in Ybor City, Florida. This picture in this photo, Amelia is the woman who is in the wheelchair. Her daughter, Margot, is to the right, and her son is in the background, Pedro, and her daughter-in-law is standing to her right. Her name is Mercedes Blanco. Her husband is in the background. So I learned about Amelia when I was a teenager. My grandmother, Norma Alfonso, showed me an article she clipped from the Tampa Tribune back in 1990. This was roughly 12 years earlier, 12 years before I saw the photo at least. "Sarah, come look at this," she yelled, calling me over to her rose-colored kitchen island. On the counter, my grandma placed a white 2-inch 3-ring binder that I had seen many times before. Norma, who was born in Ybor City in 1931, saved anything and everything she found about the old neighborhood. Placemats from lunch counters, pamphlets from museums, excerpts from books, and articles from newspapers all found their way into her portable archive. As I took a seat in the kitchen, my grandmother slipped the pristine clipping from the acetate sleeve, extended her finger, and pointed at 2 women in a reprinted photograph. "This is Abuela Amelia," she said, "and here's her daughter, your Aunt Margot." This is a scanned image of the clipping. The writing is that of Norma's that I described, and those are Amelia, who you saw in the wheelchair, and her daughter Margot, who was standing beside her years later. And here was her granddaughter, your Aunt Margot. So as she extended this, and this was what she described, what I saw was that this black and white image, it captured a sea of women linked arm in arm, marching through what I recognized as La Avenida Sétima, 7th Avenue, the main thoroughfare of Ybor City. As I sat there gazing at the picture, Norma drew 2 arrows on the clipping and labeled these women in our family. For as long as I can remember, my grandmother was on a one-woman mission to be sure my sister and I never forgot Ybor City. She drove us through the neighborhood, told us stories of our families, and kept traditions alive. Even before I saw the clipping, I knew Amelia was my grandmother's favorite grandparent. Like Norma, she hated the beach but loved to read. Amelia had a talent for cigar making, a passion for bingo playing, and an infectious joie de vivre. Those who knew her say she was loud and outspoken, a family trait that has managed to survive generations. And according to my grandfather, Gus Alfonso, Norma's husband, Amelia was an activist who was always up to something and the foil to his self-proclaimed respectable, rule-abiding family. In reality, my grandfather's father was a member and organizer of the Communist Party of the United States, the CPUSA. A truth he once revealed with a whisper and a look that made clear we would never revisit the subject. Despite the many stories Norma shared, she never told me the context of this image. Instead, I had to search for this answer on my own. In the process, I found that there was much more to Ybor City and the women in my family than my grandma was willing to explain. After all, sometimes it is the stories we hold back rather than the ones we share that reveal the essence of who we are. My grandma passed away years before I discovered the truth behind this photo of Amelia. But when I did, it shifted my understanding of both the Ybor community and the women who lived there. This picture was taken in 1937 when Norma was 5 years old, on the day that 5,000 or 7,000, it depends if you're looking at the Anglo or the Latino newspaper, which number you're going to get. The Latino newspaper says 7, the Anglo says 5. Latinas from Ybor protested the rise of fascism in Spain and the United States' refusal to condemn it. Amelia was part of this coalition of women who, during that decade, joined the ranks of Cuban and Spanish anti-fascists as they vocally opposed the Spanish Civil War abroad and Jim Crow at home, at least the way that Jim Crow applied to themselves in their community. African Americans and Ybor Latinas and Latinos did not create a cross-ethnic interracial coalition for economic equality and civil rights during this period. In fact, such an effort never even began. What emerged instead was an environment where Latinxs and Black Americans fought distinct battles that served what each community understood as their independent concerns. The activism of Amelia and women like her derived from an internationalist commitment to anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and radical leftist politics inherited from their ancestors. Throughout her life, Amelia belonged to unions. She attended meetings at the Ybor Labor Temple and participated in strikes. Collective action came naturally to Amelia, but it would have felt foreign, perhaps even dangerous, and un-American to her granddaughter. Unlike the generations of people who fought to live in Ybor City, the survival of Norma's generation depended on their transition out of the neighborhood, a process that required the remaking of their politics and the remaking of themselves. Norma's Ybor City was different from the place that pulled Amelia to Florida's southern shores near the turn of the 20th century. Cigars fell out of fashion in the 1930s, in part because they were a luxury few people could afford in the midst of the Great Depression. The world instead developed a cheap cigarette addiction and replaced the slow draw of Ybor City's famed El Príncipe de Gales brand of cigars with the quick burn of North Carolina's Lucky Strikes. This market shift devastated the industry that once made Tampa a manufacturing powerhouse and pushed many Latinos, often the highest paid cigar workers, into unemployment or underemployment. Desperate for work, many Latinas and Latinos left the city and went to New York and Pennsylvania in search of work or assistance from the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Much like African Americans in Tampa and throughout the broader South region, Latinxs, regardless of their citizenship status, had difficulty gaining access to relief work in this town. Power-holding Anglos in Tampa had the authority to determine who was and was not a member of the deserving poor. And they privileged native-born Anglos like themselves when it came to doling out the limited spaces on the WPA rosters. Norma's father, Amelia's only son Pedro, was one of thousands of men who drifted in and out of cigar factories throughout the Depression. In 1930, at the age of 20, Pedro held the esteemed high-paying position of hand roller. Yet by 1936, he worked as an iceman and later as a delivery driver. Pedro's experience was typical of the thousands of men of Ybor City. Those once trained as artisans never imagined that they would be desperate enough to accept unskilled positions. But during the Depression, they had no other choice. Like many men in Ybor during this era, Pedro vacillated between head of household and living with his wife's parents as an employed yet secondary contributor. As the heyday of the clear Havana handmade cigar dwindled, so too did men's pseudo-monopoly on cigar making and steady wages. Amelia was a cigar maker in a large factory when my grandmother was young, a position that would have been difficult for her to hold roughly 10 years earlier. Amelia is in this picture. She is in the second row right here, and her best friend, her sister, is sitting across from her at the workers' bench. Both in Havana and in Ybor City, cigar making was highly skilled work, men's work, and few women occupied this professional space. Instead, women were among the many cigar workers, a term reserved to describe all laborers in the cigar industry, who performed other jobs within factories. At the height of the industry, most women spent their days in factory basement as despalilladoras, also which translates to strippers, those who ripped the stem from the tobacco leaf and prepared the raw material for production. These women made a low wage. A lucky few labored on the main floor as buncheras, those who sat next to or stood behind a cigar maker and prepared filler for the center of the cigar, and brought home a slightly higher weekly paycheck. Other women earned a pittance assembling cigar boxes or slipping bands on finished cigars. In an attempt to preserve what was left of the Cuban cigar industry, however, Ybor City manufacturers fired skilled Latino craftsmen and hired unskilled Latina workers to take their place on the main floor as cigar makers. Not only did this decision save a handful of factories that survived the aftershock of the Depression, but it gave women a place of value within the factory and transferred economic and political power from Latinos to Latinas within households, unions, and the Ybor community. The Ybor City of Norma's youth was a place where women had wielded considerable authority. And if we're thinking about what economic devastation looked like, there were roughly at the height 200 handmade cigar factories in Ybor City. And by this period of time, there were 20. And of those 20, only a fraction did handmade cigar work like what you see in the picture. Many were beginning to transition to mechanized production. While women such as Amelia marched through the streets of Ybor City and assumed positions of influence within cigar factories, children like Norma navigated a new world. My grandmother grew up surrounded by the ghost of what the Cuban cigar industry and Ybor City used to be. Here's pictures of she. Amelia is in the background. She is the rounder grandmother sitting in the back, and this is with her siblings. And the other is a photo of she walking through Ybor City, what it began to look like by the time that she was a teenager. My grandmother grew up surrounded by the ghost of what the Cuban cigar industry in Ybor City used to be. Central to the economic survival of broader Tampa, a reality that once gave this immigrant community considerable local power. Norma listened to her family members tell stories of great strikes and watched as her parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles followed in the footsteps of their ancestors as they traveled in and out of leftist political circles in an attempt to regain what the Ybor community had lost. Despite the hours women and men of the immigrant and first U.S.-born generation spent in union halls, on strike, and in the streets during the Depression years, their advocacy did not result in an increase of salary or the establishment of a living wage within the Cuban cigar industry of Ybor. My grandma often reminded my sister and me that although she was a part of a family with working parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, all of whom shared resources, both she and her brother would slice the soles of their shoes and insert cardboard to extend their length and prolong their use, because new clothing was a luxury that this family could not afford. The memory of poverty and the stress of struggle was not something Norma cherished later in life. But she did praise the soup kitchens and community storehouses that opened in Ybor City as a result of the New Deal. Access to government subsidies kept the Blanco family fed and led to new culinary inventions within the Ybor community. Platillo, an eclectic combination of cooked spaghetti sliced with Vienna sausages and mixed with sofrito, and a little bit of canned tomato sauce, topped with a fried egg, became a nostalgic favorite, as did sweet treats such as saltine crackers topped with cream cheese and guava paste. Like many children of my grandma's generation, such assistance endeared Franklin D. Roosevelt, as well as the U.S. government, to them throughout their lifetimes. As Norma walked through Ybor City during the 1940s, the whitewashed wooden casitas, now aged, sun-bleached, and termite-ridden, seemed to reflect the state of her community. Ybor City indeed was still there, but the Cuban cigar industry and the future of the neighborhood seemed as precarious as the structures that provided shelter to its residents. As a result, Latinx parents began to encourage formal education rather than the monetary value of early wage work to provide their children with a path toward broader occupational opportunities, even at the cost of the family's immediate economic needs. My grandmother, along with her peers, entered Tampa's segregated public education system, where she learned that race determined which school one attended and the stereotypes connected to being a native Spanish speaker from Ybor City in an English-speaking, Anglo-dominated Southern society. Because Norma was Latina with light skin, understood as non-Black in broader Tampa, she received her education inside institutions designed for Anglo students. In these places, Anglo teachers used corporal punishment to discourage the use of Spanish in their classrooms. In some instances, this sent some young Spanish-speaking students to hospitals, while Anglo students invoked locally created racial epithets to refer to anyone from Ybor City, regardless of their race or their ethnicity. Such personal experiences, combined with the knowledge of anti-leftist, anti-Latinx intimidation and violence perpetuated by Anglos against Latinas and Latinos in the community, led to a personal and political remaking. The children of Norma's generation did not dream of a place at the cigar makers' benches. Instead, they hoped to join the cheerleading squad, participate on the Anglo baseball team, and be seen as people who were equal and accepted by Anglo society and able to access a future that entailed a steady salary and a pathway out of poverty for themselves and their extended families. Along the way, everyone made choices as they decided who they would be in a new world. This process of remaking required much pain as well as much forgetting. Ybor City, so my book, Ybor City, Crucible of the Latina South, it examines the transformation of 3 generations of Latinxs, one immigrant and the others U.S. born, who struggled, worked, and dreamed in Ybor City and Tampa, Florida. It centers on the years between the movement of the Cuban cigar industry from the island to Florida in the 1860s and the rise of urban renewal's wrecking ball in the 1960s. To tell the story of how people, places, and politics become who and what they are. From the turn of the century through the 1930s, women, along with men, immigrated to Ybor, where they made cigars, raised families, and created community as they battled for just employment, supported Cuban independence, organized against fascism, and wrestled with Jim Crow. After World War II, however, their children and grandchildren negotiated a very different world. This changing social and political landscape pushed the younger generation to redefine who they were in order to survive. In the racial milieu of the South, U.S.-born Latinas and Latinos disavowed radical leftist and politics and defined themselves against Blackness to transform their image from foreign subversives to acceptable U.S. citizens. The result of this shift was the creation of a new ethnic, non-Black identity, as well as proximity to Anglo society and the gain of political power. This study, Ybor City, it explores the South as an international multiracial borderland, and it argues that in this space, gender played a central role in the remaking of race, community, region, and nation. These stories, which center on Latinas and are told through the lens of women, expand our limited understanding of women's leadership and early movements for social and economic justice. By showing how Latina and Latino identities and community solidarities evolved, my book illustrates the ways Latinas developed and directed political strategy to achieve economic security and political representation for themselves and their community. At times, these tactics were vehemently anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, and anti-racist. But at others, they aligned with some ideas of white supremacy, as some Latinas and Latinos bent to the pressure of Jim Crow as they sought entry into Anglo society and mainstream politics. Furthermore, this book examines the city as a space of transnational collisions. In Ybor City and Tampa, political networks and cultural identities connected the United States, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Central and South America, as well as Europe. Over 3 generations, these cross-border exchanges critically influenced the physical shape of Ybor and Tampa, as well as the political and social consciousness of the people within these places. The organization of the book, it follows 4 chronologically aligned chapters: building, resisting, surviving, and remaking, which is paralleled with the idea of ethnography between searching and finding that places myself as the historian within the narrative. By scrutinizing the South through the lens of gender, the story of Ybor City illustrates how Latinas and Latinos navigated both real and imagined borders that emerged, shifted between people and communities over space and time. The story of Ybor City, it encourages readers to rethink what it means to be of Cuban descent, live in Florida, survive in the South, and advocate for visibility and representation within the United States. Such a charge requires that people consider Latinxs of Cuban descent as more than a singular monolithic conservative political stereotype. The history of Latinxs in Ybor City exists in the shadow of the history of Latinxs in Miami. Although both of these communities trace their roots back to the island of Cuba, the circumstances of their migration, the development of their politics, and the creation of their communities are distinct despite the existence of a shared national heritage. For example, the Naviera Coffee Company, a century-old coffee mill in Ybor City that makes espresso for Café con Leche and Cafecito, produces different blends of coffee to satisfy the tastes of the Tampa and Miami markets. The original blend, developed for the residents of Ybor, is strong, yet it is cut with chicory. This is a preference that emerged with time as laboring cigar workers added the root to their espresso to stretch resources and make their grounds last longer. The Miami blend, in contrast, consists of pure dark roasted beans intended to mirror the taste of espresso from the island. In short, right, being of Cuban descent and from Ybor City or Tampa is different than being of Cuban descent and from Miami or South Florida. The distinctions between the two communities is not merely political or historical, but also cultural and evident in something as simple as coffee preference. Perhaps apt for today with all of our cafecitos. The women and men who came to Ybor City began their migration roughly 70 years before the end of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. The moment that began the process of turning Miami into Havana, USA, and making the state of Florida synonymous with Cubans, Cold War politics, and anti-communism. This timeline is important. The people who went to Ybor City decades before were part of the first wave of Cuban migration to Florida. They were working class, politically leftist, and multiracial, and had a sense of self that conflicted with the predominantly white, pro-capitalist, middle class, and upper class people who fled to Cuba in the immediate wake of Fidel Castro's rise to power. In fact, many Ybor residents of the immigrant generation who have considered themselves as living in exile as a result of the ideas and politics of those who arrived in Miami between the late 1950s and 1960s. Some also went to Tampa, but that came with great contrast and friction. During the 1950s, some of the women and men from Ybor City joined and supported the local 26th of July movement, the organization that supported Castro and the Cuban Revolution, as well as the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, the organization that advocated for the interests of the new Cuban government to the U.S. Most Latinxs from Ybor, however, were tepidly supportive of observers who hoped the revolution would improve their ancestral homeland, but they were not passionate enough about this war to donate their money or dedicate their time to the cause. Few of the U.S.-born generation in Ybor City, which came of age during World War II, defined their lives in support or in opposition to the new Cuban government, because the Cuban Revolution was not their primary political focus of the era. These women and men instead concerned themselves with gaining political power in Florida and were successful in developing a Latino Democratic Party contingent. Since Nick Nuccio, an Ybor City native and Sicilian, of Sicilian descent, became the mayor of Tampa in 1956, the city has elected only one Republican to lead the city of Tampa. Such a voting pattern remains consistent with the election of congresspeople from Tampa. Only 2 Republicans have been elected since the creation of Florida's 14th district in 1973. Although Tampa and Hillsborough County can swing in presidential elections, a Republican candidate has not received a majority vote in Tampa since 2008. According to the 2020 census, the area recognized as Tampa, which includes all suburbs within Hillsborough County, is the 3rd largest metropolitan region in Florida, behind Jacksonville and Miami, and includes roughly 1.5 million people, of whom 56% are non-Anglo, including 30% who self-identify as Latinx or Hispanic. In this place, the 3rd most populous state in the nation, a place that controls, when I wrote the book, 29, but now 30, electoral votes, and frequently determines the outcome of national elections, it is essential to understand the diverse political cultures of this place, as well as how people become who they are. Rather than thinking of Florida as a place defined by one Latinx community, this book urges readers to consider that the state is a place with multiple Latinx communities, many of which have different political ideologies, traditions, and concepts of self. Now, one of the things that I sought to do, and that I'll throw in before I finish this, is thinking about Ybor City and this legacy and what it means and why we remember certain things and why we forget others. It pushed me to think about how to translate this work beyond a book and into community. In addition to writing the book, I have begun a public history project that I piloted back in 2023, although it was prior to that an idea way back in 2021. It took a long time to put together. And it was the first project that brought together the Hillsborough County's Historical Commission and the City of Tampa's Arts and Culture Project. I partnered with a local muralist and artist. She's Cuban American. Her name is Michelle Sawyer, who does the artwork on this project. And one of the things that we did was that we launched the first site that sought to remember the anti-fascist march and the politics of this community. And so in March of 2023, we launched the Mural and Marker Project. So if you're in Ybor City today, that picture that I showed you of all those women lined along 7th Avenue, there's now what I would call a living monument that allows us to remember where history happened, even though we cannot see it. So right now we're in the process of building this out with 5 different sites that will bring together art and markers. And this is the only one in all of Ybor City that notes women's political work, if not Latina effort beyond owning a bakery. And it's the only marker that has any essence of the politics and the texture that brought to what made Ybor City unique and what it was. And I will stop now.
Thank you so much. I definitely now have to go to Ybor City and find that beautiful, beautiful, gorgeous mural, which I believe Michelle Sawyer is here in the call. So wonderful, wonderful, beautiful work. Uh, and I love the concept of living history and the importance to, make visible the past when we can no longer, if you don't have interpretation or signage, it makes it so difficult to learn about the history of places and the very diverse stories that exist and that are often untold.